This is Mr. Wesley, and if the physical intimacy in your marriage has quietly disappeared, not dramatically, not with a conversation that marked the moment it changed, but gradually and then completely, in the way that things end when neither person is quite willing to name what is ending, you are not alone, and the problem is almost certainly not what you think it is. The sexless marriage is one of the most privately carried experiences in the lives of men over 50, and it is privately carried precisely because the culture around it offers almost nothing useful. The advice that exists tends to fall into two equally unhelpful categories. The first is the performance category. The dates, the gestures, the romantic weekends, the explicit communication workshops, the deliberate investment in the conditions that are supposed to produce desire. The second is the clinical category. The hormonal testing, the medical explanations, the physiological frameworks that treat the absence of desire as a symptom of a diagnosable condition, rather than as the entirely predictable outcome of a relational dynamic that has been running in a specific direction for a specific and considerable length of time. Both categories miss the most important thing, which is that in most long marriages over 50, where physical intimacy has significantly declined or disappeared, the cause is not medical and the solution is not performance. The cause is relational. It is the specific and accumulated state of the emotional connection between the two people in the marriage, expressed through the one dimension of the relationship that is most sensitive to that state and most immediately responsive to its deterioration. And the reason trying harder makes it worse. The reason the dates and the gestures and the deliberate romantic investment consistently fail to produce the result they are intended to produce, and frequently produce the opposite, is that they are addressing the symptom while leaving the cause not only unaddressed, but actively reinforced by the specific quality of effort being applied. I am Mr. Wesley. Let me give you the 10 reasons, and then let me give you the mechanism that connects them all. The first reason is the emotional distance that has accumulated across the years of the marriage without either person marking the moment it began. I have described this across multiple earlier videos in this series as cumulative drift, the gradual and largely unconscious movement of two people away from genuine connection and toward functional coexistence that happens in long marriages when the deliberate investment in the emotional connection stops being treated as a requirement and starts being assumed to maintain itself. Physical desire in a long-term partnership is far more dependent on the quality of the emotional connection than the cultural conversation around desire tends to acknowledge. The research on this is specific and consistent. Women's desire in long-term relationships is particularly and specifically responsive to the quality of the emotional connection, to whether she feels genuinely known, genuinely seen, genuinely attended to as a specific and ongoing person, rather than as a familiar fixture of the household. When that quality deteriorates, desire does not simply reduce proportionally. It tends to switch off in a way that is difficult to reverse through the application of more performance, because the performance itself communicates that the man seeking the intimacy has not understood what produced its absence. The second reason is the resentment archive. I described this in detail in the resentment archive video earlier in this series, and I want to apply it here specifically to the physical intimacy dimension, because the connection between accumulated unresolved resentment and the absence of desire is one of the most direct and most consistently documented connections in the research on long-term sexual relationships. A woman who is carrying a significant and unacknowledged resentment archive does not experience desire toward the person the resentment is about, not because she has decided not to, because desire requires a quality of openness and safety and genuine orientation toward the other person that is structurally incompatible with the sustained defensive posture that significant unresolved resentment produces. The resentment archive is a closed system. Desire requires an open one. They cannot coexist in the same body at the same intensity, and when the resentment archive is large, desire is almost always the thing that gives way. The third reason is the bid system failure I have described across multiple videos in this series. Desire in long-term relationships does not emerge in a vacuum, and it does not emerge primarily in response to explicitly sexual initiatives. It emerges, over time, and through the accumulation of small and repeated experiences, from the specific and felt experience of being genuinely attended to, genuinely responded to, and genuinely invested in by the partner. The bid system is the mechanism through which that experience is built or fails to be built. The small daily reaches for connection that are either received or deflected, the accumulated record of which direction the reaching consistently went, the specific and running total that the nervous system maintains about whether the partnership is a place of genuine responsiveness or a place of consistent non-receipt. When the bid system has been running in the non-receipt direction for a sufficient length of time, the desire that requires the experience of genuine responsiveness to sustain itself simply does not have the conditions it needs. The explicit romantic initiative, the date night, the deliberate gesture, arrives against a background of a bid system that has been telling a different story for years, and the background story is louder than the foreground initiative. The fourth reason is the performance pressure dynamic, and this is the one most directly relevant to understanding why trying harder makes it worse rather than better. When a man in a sexless marriage intensifies his effort, when he becomes more attentive, more romantic, more explicitly invested in creating the conditions for intimacy, the effort itself communicates something to the woman receiving it that works against the outcome the effort is intended to produce. It communicates need, the specific and anxious need of a man who is working toward an outcome rather than genuinely connecting with a person. And the experience of being the object of that need, of being the thing that someone is working toward rather than the person they are genuinely with, does not produce the quality of openness and genuine orientation toward the other that desire requires. It produces the opposite. A woman who feels pursued for a specific outcome rather than genuinely seen as a person tends to contract rather than open, because the pursuit confirms that what is wanted from her is a function rather than her specifically, and contraction is the antithesis of desire. The fifth reason is what sex therapists call spectatoring, the specific and well-documented phenomenon in which one or both partners in a long-term relationship begin to observe their own sexual experience from a distance rather than inhabiting it from within. Spectatoring is the internal equivalent of the performance pressure dynamic. Instead of the man working toward an outcome, he is watching himself work toward an outcome, monitoring his own performance, evaluating his own adequacy in real time, and producing through that monitoring exactly the quality of anxious self-consciousness that prevents the genuine presence that physical intimacy requires. The research on spectatoring consistently identifies it as one of the primary maintaining mechanisms of sexual difficulty in long-term relationships, not the cause of the initial difficulty, which tends to lie in the relational dynamics I have described above, but the mechanism that takes an episodic difficulty and transforms it into a chronic pattern by adding a layer of self-monitoring to every subsequent encounter. The sixth reason is the touch deficit that develops in long marriages when physical affection outside of explicitly sexual contexts has gradually reduced. In healthy long-term relationships, non-sexual physical affection, the incidental touch, the casual proximity, the easy and unloaded physical contact of two people who are genuinely comfortable in each other's presence, functions as the continuous low-level maintenance of the physical connection that more explicit intimacy is built on. When that non-sexual physical affection disappears, as it tends to in marriages experiencing the cumulative drift I described earlier, the physical channel between the two people closes in a way that cannot easily be reopened by the abrupt application of more explicitly sexual initiative. The initiative arrives without the background of maintained physical warmth that makes it feel continuous rather than intrusive, and it is experienced as a request for something that the background has not been building toward, rather than as the natural expression of a connection that has been maintained all along. The seventh reason is the identity and body image dimension, and this one is specifically relevant to long marriages in the 50 and older demographic in ways that the broader conversation about sexless marriages tends to underaddress. Both partners in a long marriage over 50 are navigating significant changes in their relationship with their own bodies, the physical changes of aging, the specific and often inadequately processed changes of menopause and its male equivalent, the shifts in energy and physical capacity, and the specific relationship between body and identity that the middle years of life consistently produce. Those changes are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening inside a relationship that has a specific and accumulated history of how physical experience has been received, acknowledged, and attended to. A woman who has not experienced her changing body as something that is genuinely seen and valued by her partner is a woman who is carrying a specific and private isolation around her physical experience that closes the physical channel in ways that are not about desire in the simple sense at all. The eighth reason is the hormonal and physiological dimension, and I include it here because I said I would give you 10, and because it is genuinely relevant, even though it is the most commonly overweighted explanation in the cultural conversation around sexless marriages. The hormonal changes of perimenopause and menopause do produce physiological changes that are directly relevant to desire and physical comfort in women. Those changes are real, and they deserve to be taken seriously as a contributing factor rather than dismissed. What they are not, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is the primary cause of a sexless marriage. They are a contributing factor in a dynamic that is primarily relational, and addressing them in isolation, through hormone replacement or other medical interventions without addressing the relational dynamics that are the primary maintaining mechanisms, consistently produces limited and temporary improvements at best, because the medical intervention addresses one contributing factor while leaving the primary maintaining mechanism completely intact. The ninth reason is the unspoken contract shift that happens in many long marriages without either person naming the shift or negotiating its terms. Most couples enter a long marriage with an implicit contract about physical intimacy that neither person fully articulates, but that both people are operating against. When the marriage changes, when children arrive, when careers intensify, when the specific demands of the middle years of a shared life reorganize the available time and energy, the terms of the unspoken contract shift in ways that both people experience but neither person names. The man continues to operate against the original terms. The woman has privately renegotiated her own terms in response to the changed conditions, and that renegotiation has never been made explicit between them. The gap between his operating contract and her renegotiated one is the gap where the sexless marriage lives. And it is a gap that cannot be closed by trying harder against the original terms, because the original terms are no longer the operative ones. The 10th reason is the most fundamental and the one that connects all of the previous 9. It is the absence of genuine emotional safety in the relationship as the woman inside it experiences it. Physical intimacy, in the research on female sexuality and long-term relationships, is not primarily a function of attraction or hormones or opportunity or any of the variables that the conventional conversation tends to focus on. It is primarily a function of felt safety, the specific and ongoing experience of a woman who feels genuinely seen, genuinely received, and genuinely safe in her emotional exposure to the man she is with. When that safety is present, desire tends to be available. When it is absent, when the cumulative drift and the resentment archive and the bid system failure and all of the other dynamics I have described have eroded the felt safety of the emotional connection, desire is not a choice she is making. It is the entirely predictable absence of something that required specific conditions to be present, and those conditions have not been met for a considerable and specific length of time. Here is why trying harder makes it worse, stated as plainly as I can state it. Every form of trying harder that a man in a sexless marriage typically employs, the dates, the gestures, the romantic initiatives, the deliberate attention, is a form of performance. It is the application of effort toward an outcome, and the experience of being the object of effort toward an outcome. In a woman whose desire requires the felt safety of genuine connection, rather than the pressure of being pursued for a specific result, consistently produces a contraction rather than an opening. The harder he tries, the more clearly she feels that what is wanted from her is a function, rather than her specifically. The more clearly she feels that, the more the felt safety that desire requires recedes. And the more it recedes, the harder he tends to try, which produces more contraction, which produces more trying, which is the specific and self-reinforcing loop that the sexless marriage tends to settle into, when the standard advice about trying harder is applied to a dynamic that requires something categorically different. What the dynamic actually requires is the cessation of the performance and the beginning of the genuine presence. Not the presence that is oriented toward the outcome of physical intimacy, which is still performance even when it is not explicitly stated as such, and which she will read as exactly that within the first minute of genuine interaction. The presence that is oriented toward her specifically, the genuine curiosity about her interior experience, the genuine attention to what she is actually communicating, rather than to the management of the conditions that might produce the outcome being sought. The genuine and ongoing investment in the emotional safety that desire requires as its foundational condition. That is not trying harder, it is trying differently. And the difference between those two things is the entire difference between a dynamic that maintains itself indefinitely and one that has any genuine possibility of changing. Drop a comment. Men, which of the 10 reasons I described today do you most recognize in your own marriage? And what has been the most consistent thing you have tried that has produced less than you hoped it would? Subscribe to Real Talk Relationships. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the real dynamics inside long marriages, with the precision and the honesty that finally makes the invisible mechanisms visible and the apparently intractable patterns genuinely navigable.